and welcome to another video. In this one, I want to talk a little bit about the Maelstrom Prophecy game that we're working on. As you know, this is quite a slow burn. We're doing a bit here and a bit there, and there's plenty been done, lots of notes, but nothing really yet has been written. And I had a meeting the other day with the other author, and we were discussing setting, because really we can't work out things like livings, things like weapons, etc., until we've got an idea of our setting, obviously, because a setting based on ancient Sumeria is going to be completely different to a setting based on 19th century London, obviously. And we got to discussing the different types of setting. And part of this, I think, was triggered by some of the TV and films I've been watching recently with my own children. And one of them we've been watching is the Dark Crystal series that's on Netflix. And if you haven't seen it, it's a fantastic series to watch. Brilliantly done. Real pity they cancelled that. But then also, I recently watched Ladyhawke, which again is a classic fantasy film that you will probably have seen. If you haven't, again, it really is one to watch. But these are both fantasy films, but these are both completely and utterly different in the way they treat their setting. But I think they illustrate some of the pros and cons of different types of setting when it comes to setting design for a game. And that really is where I'm going with this. So on the one hand, you have Ladyhawke. So for those of you who haven't seen it, it's a film set, I think, in 13th century France. You've got a knight and his lady, but they're cursed, etc. And I won't give away the plot, but it's basically 13th century France with some fantastical elements. So this is really familiar fantasy. Obviously, this is easy to design, because if I'm sitting down and I'm writing a game based on Ladyhawke the film, I go, well, it's 13th century France. I've done my design. Any particular detail I need, I can go and look up or extrapolate. So I might not have a complete price list for 13th century France, but I'm going to have at least a partial price list from historical documents. If I need to know what food the peasants ate, easy. What food did the lords eat? Easy. What was the daily routine like? Easy. What was the social? What about laws? What about houses? What about castles? What about churches? What about design? What about anything? Almost anything. I can just go to a historical record and pluck that detail from it. And of course, that would apply whether I'm designing a game in 19th century London or ancient Sumeria. You've got differing amounts of information, but there is information there that you can base it on. So it makes it really, really, really easy to design, because 99% of your design is it's 13th century France. And that's done. It's done for you. History has generated that setting for you. There's another big advantage of doing this. You could, if you're sitting down and you're going to run a game, right? You know, gaming group, we're running a new setting this week. We're going to start a new campaign, and it's basically 13th century France. So we'll create your characters, and then next week we'll run session one. If you've got engaged players, they can all rush off. They can read up about 13th century France, even just on, you know, Wikipedia and general source. Doesn't have to be primary source and historian level research. Just needs to be a look into it. And there are enough pictures, there are enough extant art, there's enough everything that the players can come back the following week and go, yep, I know exactly where we're adventuring. I can picture it in my mind's eye. It's easy. And that's one of the benefits. Everyone knows it. And of course, if you go for one of the really well known, so we're running a campaign set in early Imperial Rome. We're running a campaign set in Victorian London. We're running a campaign set in 1920s New York. We're running a campaign set in ancient Egypt. We're running any of these give you a pre-made setting that is there that you don't have to explain to your players other than the title. Really easy. But there's a couple of downsides to it as well. some players may consider it boring. Oh no, another medieval setting, 13th century France. All of our games are set in medieval. Well, fine, because it depends on what you do. And of course, running a game in 7th century sub-Saharan Africa with some of the kingdoms that were developing there at the time would be very unknown to most players. Now, you may well live in sub-Saharan Africa and know a lot about the history there. Fantastic. But I would imagine that many players, especially in Northern Europe, in the US, in Australasia, wherever, are not going to be fully familiar with sub-Saharan 7th century West African kingdoms. So obviously it depends. But then the other big problem with doing that is if you have got a thing set in 13th century France with curses, it doesn't feel very fantastical. It doesn't feel very, what's the right word? Exciting's not quite the right word, because you can have excitement from any setting, but it doesn't feel very different. And of course, one of the reasons we play RPGs is to have that different experience. We don't play a game, I wouldn't go, yippee, we're playing a game set in Yorkshire in 2025, where I spend my days writing games and chasing sheep around and teaching scientists. It wouldn't be a very exciting game for me to play because it's something that I'm familiar with. When I play an RPG, I want there to be a fantastical element very often, or something different. It doesn't have to be magic, although of course a lot of games, even modern and sci-fi games, have psionics or have modern supernatural whatever. And I think that's what appeals to us a lot about games. So what about the other type of game? Because if we've got the familiar setting, 13th century France, we've got the opposite as well. We've got the Dark Crystal, Age of Resistance. You've got, what's that? That's 5-6 hours of TV plus the film. That really does feel fantastical. That feels completely alien because there's no humans. There's no familiar animals or plants or indeed anything. Everything is alien. You've got the political structures, the Ormordra and the individual Mordras and the Skeksis as kings and so on, as emperor and so on. So all of that is fantastical. It really scratches that this is a completely different world. And it feels totally different. And of course, there is a downside to that. Firstly, as a world designer, if we were designing this for a game, I can't just go, right, well, here's my core conceit, 30th century France, and hang bits on it. I have to design everything. What foods are eaten? Because they don't eat rabbits and venison and beef and lamb and potatoes and turnips and whatever. They eat completely strange foods. So I've got to design all my foods and the buildings and the heating source and the political structure and the plants that are out there and the wild animals that are out there, dangerous or not, and the domesticated animals and the history and everything has got to be designed. Every single thing from scratch has to be designed. And it doesn't matter how careful you are as a GM, as a world designer, you will miss something. So the first nighttime adventure, one of the players says, so what do we use as light sources when we're out adventuring? And you go, we use fireflies captured in glass globes. Okay, make a note. That's another bit of world setting you almost have to do on the fly. But what if you said there's no insects? Then there are no fireflies, so maybe they're glowing lizards, but that doesn't quite work because... And so it's harder to make that coherent story. Equally, if you've got a familiar setting and you start your adventure with, so you're all sat around a table in the Gutted Pig, the local tavern, the innkeeper bustles over and plonks 4 tankards of ale on the table. At that point, an old man with a beard sits down and says, I hear you're adventurers, I think I've got a job for you. Adventure off going. Whereas if you've got an alien type world and you say, so you sit down at the communal tables in the square, and one of the food hosts hurries over with 3 plates of drogon and puts down 4 tall clay cups of Zarbar. Players are going to say, what's drogon then? And even if you've written a setting guide, they will have forgotten because they can't remember everything. And what's Zabar? So you have to explain what those are. And then you say, and then a tall Mornar sits down at your table and says, I hear you are Tolans. What do these words mean? And of course, you can go back and use adventurers for Tolans or whatever, but then that takes the fantastical out again. And if you're trying to make an alien fantastical world, you need those fantastical terms. And of course, if we look at RPGs, there are loads of settings out there that are very, very, very fantastical. And there are loads of settings out there that are modern history with a small veneer of change. And obviously, most settings are going to be somewhere in the middle of those 2 extremes. It's not going to be purely historical, with a tiny element of fantastical, or purely alien. It's going to be somewhere in the middle. So, your classic D&D worlds have orcs and trolls and goblins and dragons and so on and so forth. But they still ride horses, and they still eat similar foods that we would eat, and they still live in similar houses and use similar heating and lighting and political titles, king and lord, duke and knight and so on. So there's somewhere in the middle. But where on that scale do you pitch a new setting? And of course, that's what we were talking about with prophecy. If we go too alien, we've got to write a great big thick setting guide that players have to read and memorize before they can play the game. If we go, it is medieval plus a little bit of magic, per Doomsday, it's easy for people to pick up, but doesn't feel very fantastical, doesn't feel very different. So where do we pitch that? And I'm not going to tell you what we decided until a bit later on, but I think it is a really, really interesting discussion for setting design, whether you're writing a published setting, whether you're writing a homebrew, whether you're taking an existing setting and modifying it. Now, hopefully that was interesting, and another video soon.